The EVGA GTX 1080 FTW hybrid, this card right here, so far has had the most interesting AIO solution for a video card that we've yet tested, and that includes the MSI Seahawk / Corsair Hydro graphics for the most part. But the Gigabyte Xtreme Water Force card, which is right here, it is the GTX 1080 Xtreme with no E Water Force. That card's been waiting on the sidelines. We have not been able to get one because despite having a working relationship with Gigabyte for several years, they don't send us review samples of video cards. Thankfully, one of our viewers, Sean, did send over the card for review, so thank you, Sean, for the card. And let's get into it. The Gigabyte GTX 1080 Xtreme Water Force, as seen through its front window, uses a similar approach to GPU and GPU component cooling as EVGA does. EVGA's solution used a copper plate atop the VRAM, which you can see in our B-roll, and that then connected via TIM, or thermal interface, to the CLC cold plate. This allowed the GPU CLC to be used for sinking the heat of both the GPU and the VRAM modules, and that meant that EVGA's GPU CLC shares the solution and runs an increased GPU diode temperature than what's found on the simpler GPU-only solution of the Seahawk or Hydro graphics card, which does not cool the VRAM. For Gigabyte's card, a similar idea is deployed for VRAM module cooling, and that's then expanded and refined to include the VRM. This is done by extending a heat pipe from the copper VRAM plate to the aluminum VRM heatsink, and the two are soldered to each other, and then piping all the heat out of the metal with the liquid cooler and its cold plate. A hole in the surface of the VRAM cooling plate allows the GPU cold plate protrusion to access the GPU directly. This improves the GPU diode performance, the readout, with direct contact and higher density of copper in the cold plate. The GPU cold plate's partial isolation from the VRAM cold plate also improves the temperature performance, though Cooler Master may be doing something with their liquid flow within the CLC that further assists temperature, and we can't take it apart because it's a loaner. One thing's for certain, the GPU block is wider than some of Asetek's solutions that are purpose-built to cool silicon, and this makes Cooler Master's larger surface area copper plate fairly capable of handling all the heat from the VRAM, VRM, and GPU, and we'll show those thermal benchmarks in a moment. PET tubing is used on the cooler, making it more rigid and similar to a bendy straw in its movement. And PET tubing, if you don't know, has an inner coating along the plastic that helps insulate the coolant, but that coating can be cracked if the tubes are bent too much, which increases permeation and liquid loss. This is the only downside, really, of most coolers with PET tubing these days. This is contrary to the other common tubing material, a low permeation rubber used for the EVGA and Seahawk coolers by Asetek. Let's get into the thermal benchmarks for the Gigabyte GTX 1080 Xtreme Water Force card. For this particular review, we're reducing the FPS charts shown in the video, so you'll have to check the article link to the description below if you want more FPS charts, because ultimately the performance between all these 1080s is pretty much the same. So the point here is we're expanding the thermal and the noise sections of the review. Looking at average temperature during peak load, the Gigabyte 1080 Xtreme Water Force card manages to run at about 25.17 C delta T over ambient with an idle of 3.39 C. That places Gigabyte's solution between the Corsair and MSI Seahawk, which is the same thing, at 18.5 C, and the EVGA 1080 FTW at 29.61 C, so it's right in the middle. Pump RPM likely plays a role in this, and the fan choice also plays a big role, as we explored in the GTX 1080 hybrid versus Seahawk content. Voltage also, just as an aside, does have some impact, and Gigabyte's card runs at a higher voltage than EVGA's at 1.05 volts, and EVGA's runs at a higher voltage than Corsair's. Gigabyte's clock rate is also higher, which leads us to believe that the Cooler Master solution is likely running that higher pump RPM already discussed, and that it better isolates the GPU portion of the cold plate, and potentially that the fan has some impact on temperature performance too. In this case, the Gigabyte fan may be a little bit better. But there's a lot of variables with this Gigabyte card because of just how much it's actually cooling. The VRM is the biggest difference. Let's look at the temperature over time charts. This is the same data as we just saw, just plotted against the time on the x-axis. The point of this chart is to show the ramp-up time of the coolers. You can see they're all pretty much the same, at least these days. Looking at our endurance charts is a little more interesting though, and it shows what you're seeing on the screen now. This endurance chart shows the Gigabyte 1080 Xtreme Water Force card's performance over a 2-hour endurance run. As we've seen with numerous NVIDIA GPUs this generation, the card is clock dropping several times after the 80-minute area of testing. Clock drops fall to about 235 megahertz with this card in particular, and normally last for 1 second during some GPU boost functionality and variants. In one instance, though, we had a 30-second period of reduced clock rates that caused a visual freeze in our Metro last light loop, and this is something that we're exploring within this architecture still. NVIDIA believes that the 1 second drops are part of normal Boost 3.0 functionality, and as GPU Boost will find any possible time to reduce its clock rate in favor of power and thermals, that might be correct, but we're still researching. If the card thinks it can get away with such a reduction, it'll do it and try and reduce some of the power draw over a longer gaming session, as long as the card thinks, so to speak, that it won't impact the FPS. But we have a lot more research to do on this part of the new architecture. In the meantime, what we can see is generally comparable performance to the other cards, except with a nearly perfectly flat clock rate in the Gigabyte solution. That's what you want. So on the screen, you should be able to see at least two of the other cards, the EVGA Hybrid and the MSI Seahawk or Corsair Hydrographics, same thing. And looking at these versus the Gigabyte unit, we've got a testament to Gigabyte's thermal and power solutions. GPU Boost is able to sustain its high clock rate of about 2012 megahertz for the entire test, and that's because thermal isn't an issue and voltage runs at 1.05 volts, perfectly flat for the entire time for the most part. And in this regard, the card outperforms its other liquid-cooled competition just in terms of a flatter clock rate. The Seahawk X and EVGA FTW cards have far spikier clock rates, not terrible on EVGAs for the most part when you're actually playing games, but it does show up in benchmarks, and it does impact the low metrics after a certain point of testing. Now looking at noise levels, you can find our methodology for noise testing on the website. We only do a dB output test right now with an A filter. There's no frequency spectrum analysis because it's just frankly out of scope for the site. There are other folks who are better equipped for that, but we can do the basics. And what we've learned from testing is that the MSI Seahawk / Corsair Hydrographics is generally either slightly quieter than the EVGA Hybrid or basically tied. In the case of the radiator fan at 30% and 50%, the EVGA Hybrid and MSI Seahawk are about the same decibel level output, and when moving to 100% fan speed, we can see that there's a bit of a gap that develops, but there's a large gap with the Gigabyte Water Force card, and that's because their fan runs at a higher RPM maximally. It hits over 3,000 RPM actually on the radiator fan, and that's partly because Gigabyte, or actually mostly because Gigabyte is cooling their entire VRM, VRAM, and GPU solution with just one fan, not with a separate blower fan like these other cards have. Noise levels overall are acceptable generally because of the performance of all these coolers. You could actually run them all at a 30% fan speed and be fine. For temperatures, you'd be below most, if not all, air coolers, depending on what you're comparing against. And you'll basically never hit 100% fan speed for the Gigabyte card because it doesn't need that much cooling. It's way more cooling than is necessary. The card generally sits around 30%. And for comparison, this is where it's a bit interesting, the Seahawk and the EVGA card will generally hit around 50% max for sort of the, depending on what you're looking at, the VRM blower fan, or if you want to get similar temperature results to us, you'd be at either 100% fan speed or 50% fan speed, and the only deciding factor there is how you configure it. EVGA's fan plugs into their board, and Corsair's goes into the motherboard, so you configure the motherboard obviously as you see fit. For fan speed, generally 50 or 100% is where you'll be. That would make the Gigabyte card at 30% about the same volume as the EVGA and the MSI cards. To that end, noise isn't a huge deciding factor unless you're looking at really specific scenarios like 100% fan speed, or if you're trying to run some extreme overclock for long periods of burn-in time with a poorly ventilated case. Starting with the FPS tests, again, more of them in the article linked in the description below. Doom at 1440p Ultra positions the Gigabyte Xtreme Water Force card just above the EVGA solution for OpenGL tests, with Gigabyte at 127.7 FPS average and identical 1% and 0.1% lows to the EVGA FTW Hybrid, which runs at 124.3 FPS average. The two cards are for the most part identical in OpenGL performance for Doom, and this remains true when we switch over to Vulkan, positioning the cards within reasonable boost variants of one another when considering current Doom, Vulkan, and NVIDIA performance limitations. At 1080p Ultra, the cards are effectively identical in Vulkan performance. The 0.1 FPS difference is within variants and can be ignored as equal. And just for clarity, that's not 0.1% lows, it's 0.1 FPS difference between the two. OpenGL performance is also mostly the same, with the two barely trading lows and averages and in 1% lows, so there's no significant difference between these cards in this benchmark. 4K high settings and Mirror's Edge Catalyst position the Gigabyte card marginally ahead of the tied EVGA Hybrid and MSI Seahawk cards with 52 FPS average and 42.7 FPS 1% lows. All three liquid-cooled GTX 1080s and the MSI Twin Frozer air-cooled 1080 are performing more or less identically. 1440p also shows this with a 95 FPS average across the board for the three liquid-cooled cards and the one Twin Frozer air-cooled card. As with the previous two charts, we're seeing basically identical performance on the GTX 1080 Xtreme Water Force card as with the Hybrid from EVGA and the Hydro Graphics from Corsair and MSI. All around 59 FPS average and 45 to 47 FPS 1% lows. Nothing exciting with these FPS benchmarks, but that's what you expect when testing three cards with the same GPU, in this case GP 104-400. Let's move on to overclocking. For other charts on FPS, check the article in the description below. Here's our overclock stepping table for the Gigabyte 1080 Xtreme Water Force card. We were able to achieve a maximum stable clock rate of 2100.5 MHz, which peaked at 2151.5 MHz on occasion. Memory overclocking landed us at an effective clock rate of 11 GHz, aided by huge power target allowance by the Gigabyte solution. The card was most stable with no real voltage offset, and when at a 100 MHz core offset and 400 MHz memory offset combined. Our own 1080 Founders Edition Hybrid custom mod that we built months ago at this point is still the best overclocker we've tested from this generation, but all the board partner cards seem to be pretty lucky if you're able to achieve a 2100 MHz clock rate with overclocking on the AIB partner cards. As shown in other OC stepping tables, the EVGA card managed a higher stable overclock at 2151.5 MHz with a peak of 2164. MSI Seahawk maxed out at a 2050 MHz stable core clock with peaks at 2126 in our tests. The card runs a reference board, though, and is more simplistic in its power and thermal design. The EVGA and Gigabyte solutions are far more advanced in that both of them cool at least VRAM, and Gigabyte is cooling the VRM as well. They also both use aftermarket PCBs that are higher quality than the reference design from NVIDIA. The Gigabyte Water Force card, this one, was bought at $770 on Newegg by Sean, our viewer, who loaned it to us. In theory, the MSRP is maybe a bit lower than that, but $770 is what he was able to buy it for. I've not been able to find it in stock since we started looking at it, but that makes it the most expensive 1080 we've looked at yet, other than, I suppose, the Seahawk EK card, which we haven't reviewed, but we tore down as a pretty expensive solution. We might talk about that more later. In terms of the actual cards you can buy off shelf and use without an open loop cooler, this one's the most expensive, $770. EVGA's runs about $730 for the price, and then the MSI Seahawk and Corsair Hydro Graphics card is $750. So it's $20 more than the EVGA Hybrid, which we already kind of covered in the Hybrid versus Seahawk review, where basically the conclusion was this is a much better buy for the most part, unless Corsair and MSI drop their price closer to $700, far more reasonable for a reference board with a less intricately designed cooler. But that doesn't change the fact that this thing's $770. So we're $40 over the EVGA Hybrid with the Gigabyte solution. The Gigabyte solution does run a slightly cooler core temp. It cools the VRM better in theory, though we don't really have a good way to measure VRM temps through software. It would have to be done by drilling a hole into a cold plate and planting a thermocouple in there or something like that. Certainly not going to do that. But in theory, this cools its power design components better than the EVGA card. The EVGA card is well within acceptable range for overclocking. It overclocks slightly better, in fact, than the Gigabyte Xtreme Water Force card. But to some extent, that is silicon lottery. To use kind of the buzz phrase, it's just manufacturing differences in general. These cards for Pascal are pretty hit and miss with overclocking, as evidenced by the high overclocks on some of the Founders Edition cards, like our apparently golden sample card that we got, the 2164, with a liquid cooling mod. So as it stands right now, EVGA's hybrid is tough to beat for the price at the $730 range. Its performance is good. They perform basically the same with FPS. They perform pretty close with cooling. Gigabyte does have a better, more sophisticated solution, and one that I hope EVGA might consider for their next series of video cards, whatever that may be. So in terms of just the thermal solution, this is pretty interesting and pretty cool from a design standpoint, not just a thermal standpoint. But as a buyer, I would kind of push you towards the EVGA solution because it's more affordable. Ideally, even this drops closer to 700. 730 is kind of pushing the price comfort zone, I guess, a little bit. But 770 is pretty high up there, or 750, whatever it may be. So that's what you have to think about. Basically price, the noise charts, all of that, and additional FPS charts are in the article below if you want more information to try and make your decision. Ultimately, they're both good cards. They're just expensive, so it's down to price, and that's up to you to decide more on if it's worth it for your build. Thank you for watching. As always, Patreon link, the post-roll video, links in the description below for more information. Subscribe for more content. I'll see you all next time.